Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this public event organized with the permanent mission of the US to the United Nations and the Diplomatic Club of Geneva. My name is Philippe Burin and I'm the director of the Graduate Institute. As an academic institution that was created in the 1920s at the heyday of the League of Nations, and whose history is intertwined with the evolution of the world ever since, we are acutely sensitive to what could be harbingers of problems to come for the international community. In that respect, it is difficult to miss the deep sense of uncertainty and the many interrogations around us about the future of the world, and in particular, the future of a global rules-based order. Of course, that does not mean that it is illegitimate to find ways to improve existing organizations or arrangements and redirect money to more useful destinations. And it does not mean that positions of strength should not be made visible and used to ensure protection or promotion of one's own interest. The point is that for anything that one might want to change, there should be, for all to see, a commitment to a community of values and a sense of shared destiny. That is to say that we look forward to listening to our speaker, Mrs. Nikki, who is US Ambassador to the United Nations in New York and was previously governor of the state of South Carolina. Sorry. She is going, yes, it's better. She is going to address the question of the reform of the the Human Rights Council and has agreed to take questions from the moderator, my colleague David Sylvan, professor of political science at the Institute, and afterwards from the audience. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
I'd like to thank the Graduate Institute and for everyone that came today. Before we get started, I think it's important that we remember the senseless lives that were lost in London. The United States stands strongly with London with these careless acts, and we are committed to helping fight terrorism as it continues to go forward. The first chairman of the United Nations organization dedicated entirely to human rights was a chairwoman. Eleanor Roosevelt was elected to head the Human Rights Commission when it first met in January 1947. She was a natural choice. Mrs. Roosevelt was already well known for her heartfelt advocacy for universal human rights. She was a woman of deep faith. Her nightly prayer asked God to, quote, make us sure of the good we cannot see and the hidden good in the world. Eleanor Roosevelt was an idealist, but she was no pushover. The first item on the Commission's agenda was drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. During the debate, the United States and the Soviet Union clashed repeatedly in some of the opening skirmishes of the Cold War. The Soviet delegate taunted Mrs. Roosevelt. How could the United States call itself a champion of human rights when African Americans were still discriminated against? To which Mrs. Roosevelt acknowledged that yes, the United States still had problems and progress was being made. And then she proposed a deal that quieted the Soviet delegate. She said the Soviets could send a delegation to observe the United States if the United States could do the same to the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviets never did and never would give free rein to a US delegation. She was making a point. She was calling out a fellow commission member for using human rights as a cover for its political agenda. Mrs. Roosevelt's vision of the Human Rights Commission was bigger than any one country. She saw the commission as a place for conscience, not politics. She knew that if it was allowed to become a forum for hypocrisy and political point scoring, it would do more to hurt the cause of human rights than to help it. My country has a unique beginning, founded on human rights, holding self-evident the truth that all men are created equal with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, America did not invent these rights. God did. Simply by our birth, human beings are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. These rights belong to all of us. They are not the gift of any government. They cannot legitimately be taken away by any government. The American idea is that government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. Government should secure our rights, not violate them. We continue striving to achieve this principle through self-government, using elections and the rule of law to hold our leaders accountable. The inherent dignity of the individual is not secured by words, but by actions. This is the standard by which we judge ourselves as a nation and by which we invite others to judge us as well. It is this commitment to the equal worth of all human beings that leads the United States to support universal human rights. And of course, we are not alone. There are many other nations, both on the Council and off, that affirm universal human rights and act to protect and extend them. When the human rights has acted with clarity and integrity, it has advanced the cause of human rights. It has brought the names of prisoners of conscience to international prominence and given voice to the voiceless. At times, the Council has placed a spotlight on individual country violators and spurred action, including convening emergency sessions to address the war crimes being committed by the Assad regime in Syria. The Council's Commission of Inquiry on North Korea led to the Security Council action on human rights abuses there. The Council is at its best when it is calling out human rights violators and abuses and provoking positive action. It changes lives. It pushes back against the tide of cynicism that is building in our world. And it reassures us that it deserves our continued investment of time and treasure. But there is a truth that must be acknowledged by anyone who cares about human rights. When the Council fails to act properly, when it fails to act at all, it undermines its own credibility and the cause of human rights. It leaves the most vulnerable to suffer and die. It fuels the cynical belief that countries cannot put aside self-interest and cooperate on behalf of human dignity. It reinforces our growing suspicion that the Human Rights Council is not a good investment of our time, money, and national prestige. Tragically, we've been down this road before. In 2005, then Secretary General Kofi Annan disbanded the precursor to the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Commission. He blamed what he called its credibility deficit. The description was well earned. Many of the world's worst human rights offenders were elected to the seats on the commission. They used those positions not to advance human rights, but to shield themselves from criticism or to criticize others. In short, the commission had lost the world's trust. It had stained and set back the cause of human rights. These problems were supposed to have been fixed when the new council was formed. Sadly, the case against the Human Rights Council today looks an awful lot like the case against the discredited Human Rights Commission over a decade ago. Once again, over half the current member countries failed to meet basic human rights standards as measured by Freedom House. Countries like Venezuela, Cuba, China, Burundi, and Saudi Arabia occupy positions that obligate them to, in the words of the resolution that created the Human Rights Council, uphold the highest standards of human rights. They clearly do not uphold those highest standards. And once again, as with the disgraced and disbanded Human Rights Commission, The victims of the world's most egregious human rights violations are too often ignored by the very organization that is supposed to protect them. In Venezuela, the government has systematically destroyed civil society through arbitrary detention, torture, and blatant violations of freedom of the press and freedom of expression. Children are starving to death. Mothers dig through trash cans to feed their families. This is a crisis that has been 18 years in the making. The Venezuelan people have been robbed of their human rights. And yet, not once has the Human Rights Council seen fit to condemn Venezuela. Quite the contrary, the Council chose to showcase Venezuela's work while protesters were being beaten in the streets. Just 2 years ago, President Maduro was invited to address the Council, just weeks after Venezuela was re-elected as a member. In Cuba, the government continues to arrest and detain critics and human rights advocates. The government strictly controls the media and severely restricts the Cuban people's access to the internet. Political prisoners by the thousands continue to sit in Cuban jails. Yet Cuba has never been condemned by the Human Rights Council. It, too, is a member country. In fact, Cuba uses its membership in the Council as proof that it is a supporter of human rights, instead of a violator that it is. The Cuban Deputy Foreign Minister called Cuba's 2016 re-election to the Human Rights Council, quote, irrefutable evidence of Cuba's historic prestige in the promotion and protection of all human rights for Cubans. This is a reversal of the truth that would make George Orwell blush. The list goes on. In 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine and took over Crimea. This illegal occupation resulted in thousands of civilian deaths and injuries, as well as arbitrary detentions. No special meeting of the Human Rights Council was called, and the abuses continue to mount. Robert Mugabe continues his decades-long campaign of repression in Zimbabwe. Nothing from Geneva. Instead, human rights violators, Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea took advantage of a council review to commend Mugabe's so-called promotion and protection of human rights. The Human Rights Council has been given a great responsibility. It has been charged with using the moral power of universal human rights to be the world's advocate for the most vulnerable among us. Judged by this basic standard, the Human Rights Council has failed. In case after case, it has been a forum for politics, hypocrisy, and evasion, not the forum for conscience that its founders envisioned. It has become a place for political manipulation rather than the promotion of universal values. Those who cannot defend themselves turn to this council for hope, but are too often disappointed by inaction. Once again, the world's foremost human rights body has tarnished the cause of human rights. The United Nations must now act to reclaim the legitimacy of universal human dignity. For all of us, this is an urgent ask. Human rights are central to the mission of the United Nations. Not only are they the right thing to do, they're the smart thing to do. I dedicated the U.S. presidency of the Security Council in April to making the connection between human rights and peace and security. This is a cause that is bigger than any one organization. If the Human Rights Council is going to be an organization we entrust to protect and promote human rights, it must change. If it fails to change, then we must pursue the advancement of human rights outside of the Council. America does not seek to leave the Human Rights Council. We seek to reestablish the Council's legitimacy. There are a couple of critically necessary changes. First, the UN must act to keep the worst human rights abusers from obtaining seats on the Council. As it stands, elections for membership to the Council are over before the voting even begins. Regional blocs nominate slates of predetermined candidates that never face any competition for votes. No competition means no scrutiny of candidates' human rights records. We must change the election so countries are forced to make the case for membership based on their records, not on their promises. Selection of members must occur out in the open for all to see. The secret ballot must be replaced with open voting. Countries that are willing to support human rights violators to serve on the Human Rights Council must be willing to show their faces. They know who they are. It's time for the world to know who they are. Second, the Council's agenda item 7 must be removed. This, of course, is the scandalous provision that singles out Israel for automatic criticism. There is no legitimate human rights reason for this agenda item to exist. It is the central flaw that turns the Human Rights Council from an organization that can be a force for universal good into an organization that is overwhelmed by a political agenda. Since its creation, the Council has passed more than 70 resolutions targeting Israel. It has passed just 7 on Iran. This relentless, pathological campaign against a country that actually has a strong human rights record makes a mockery not of Israel, but of the Council itself. The Council's effort to create a database designed to shame companies for doing business in Israeli-controlled areas is just the latest in this long line of shameful actions. Blacklisting companies without even looking at their employment practices or their contributions to local empowerment, but rather based entirely on their location in areas of conflict is contrary to the laws of international trade and to any reasonable definition of human rights. It is an attempt to provide an international stamp of approval to the anti-Semitic BDS movement. It must be rejected. Getting rid of Agenda Item 7 would not give Israel preferential treatment. Claims against Israel could still be brought under Agenda Item 4, just as claims can be brought there against any other country. Rather, removal of Item 7 would put all countries on equal footing. The Council is no more justified in having a separate agenda item on Israel than it is on having one for the United States or Canada or France or the United Kingdom. More appropriate would be to have an agenda item on North Korea, Iran, and Syria, the world's leading violators of human rights. These changes are the minimum necessary to resuscitate the Council as a respected advocate of universal human rights. For our part, the United States will not sit quietly while this body, supposedly dedicated to human rights, continues to damage the cause of human rights. In the end, no speech and no structural reforms will save the members of the Human Rights Council from themselves. If they continue to put politics ahead of human rights, they will continue to damage the cause that they supposedly serve. All those years ago, Mrs. Roosevelt understood this. She was engaged in building an institution to bring the nations of the world together to protect the most vulnerable. But she knew the good she was seeking would not come from that institution, but from the hearts of men and women who would work in it. Every night she prayed, "Save us from ourselves and show us a vision of a world made new." I believe that vision is still achievable. I believe we can come together. I know there are many who share the belief. The status quo is not acceptable. It is not a place for countries who champion human rights. I call on all like-minded countries to join making the Human Rights Council reach its intended purpose. Let the world be on notice. We will never give up the cause of universal human rights. Whether it's here or in other venues, we will continue this fight. Thank you.
Ambassador. And just the format is that I've been asked to ask a few questions and to have a bit of a dialogue with the ambassador, and then we're going to open it for a whopping 10 minutes or so to the crowd there, because I understand you have to actually catch a flight in a short time. So let me start out, as I'm sure you can imagine. When it was announced the other day that I was going to be moderating this, I immediately started getting deluged with emails from students of mine, from colleagues, and in some cases from total strangers, who asked me a series of questions, which I'm sure you could predict some of the questions they were going to be asked. And while I'm not going to try to make myself their kind of voice there, one of the things to start out with that I was really quite struck by is that the poster for your visit actually mentioned, among other things, that you were prioritizing human rights. And this comes out in the talk you gave at the Council on Foreign Relations, and it comes out in a number of interviews you've given. And I was struck by the fact that when I think about this, about prioritizing, normally what we think about is the way that one desirable goal will be put as more important than another one. And if I look at the countries that you called out, and not just in your speech just a moment ago, but in others' speeches, you mentioned, I wrote some of these down, Syria, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Zimbabwe, and Iran. And I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that none of these are exactly on the US hit list of countries that we have strong relations with in terms of trade relations or military relations or so forth. So I guess the question is, what does prioritizing actually mean? Does it mean what countries with whom the United States is close, would human rights mean that they would actually sacrifice other things to call out these countries?
I think what we're looking at is the fact that there are a lot of priorities. In a time where we're seeing a lot of threats around the world, and in a time where things are very uncertain, what the United States is trying to do is lead. And what we consider leading is saying what we are for, what we are against, and making sure there's no gray areas. So there are certain countries that we are working with, whether it's counterterrorism, whether we're trying to work on other issues, but we're never going to give up human rights. There's a reason I called them out, because when it comes to human rights, they don't get a pass. When it comes to human rights, we have to keep American values at the forefront and share them. That's what we're proud of. That's what we've always done. And that's what we're going to continue to do. So, but it's not one where we can say, we're not going to deal with that country at all. If we're going to lead, we have to deal with all of them. But that doesn't mean we don't mention things when we see something wrong.
So the idea would be to mention things.
I'm doing more than mentioning. You know, what we did was in the Security Council, they had never once taken up human rights as an issue because they didn't see it as part of peace and security. Human rights is absolutely a part of peace and security. If you look at what happened in Syria and you look at the fact that all of this conflict started from 13 to 15-year-old boys out there spraying graffiti on a wall against the government. And then the government turns around, arrests those boys, tortures those boys, pulls their nails out, bloodied and beaten, they give them back to their parents. Their parents go to the streets, very upset. Naturally, other parents are going to go along with that. And now you look later. I've talked before about Tunisia. You look at the fruit stand worker. He was tired of being stolen from. He was tired of the government. So he was so desperate that he stood out in the streets and set himself on fire to make a point. All of these conflicts that we have, if you go back, they always go back to human rights. So what I was trying to do with the Security Council, making that my major theme in the presidency, was we can prevent this. If we see something wrong, if we see a government that's not taking care of their people, if we get in front of it, we can stop Assyria. We can stop the Arab Spring issues. We can stop all of these things from happening in the first place. It's the reason why I'm so concerned about Venezuela. Is in Venezuela, it's hard-pressed to see that Maduro's not following in the same steps of Assad. And we need to make sure we stop it before it gets to that point and make sure we're doing something about it.
Could you imagine any U.S. military allies or major trading partners with whom there would be some kind of confrontation over human rights?
I make it at the Security Council all the time. The reason I came to do Venezuela here was because the Human Rights Council wasn't doing it. So I will be very loud about human rights with any of the violators that do that. That's my job. That's what I expect to do. That's what I think is important. And so I'll continue to express that. No one's ever accused me of being quiet.
I would never accuse a governor of any form of state of being quiet.
That's right.
So let me ask you then a follow-up. One of the things that you had mentioned, and I was quite pleased to hear this, you started out your speech by referring to Eleanor Roosevelt. And since I am an academic, I have the curse of actually having studied some of these things. And one of the things that actually comes up very interestingly is at the time that Eleanor Roosevelt was fighting the good battle about the Universal Declaration and so forth, the United States government, under her sometime ally, Harry Truman, member of her own political party, was at the same time busily sending aid to Greece, which was massively violating human rights. And before the Korean War, I'm not even talking about after it broke out, to South Korea, which was slaughtering large numbers of people. Was this a problem for the United States to be doing these kinds of things? Or was it the kind of thing that under the conditions of the Cold War was reasonable?
I'm not going to attempt to go and reevaluate the past. What I am going to do is talk about the future. And I think what's very important in this day and time where we're seeing so much extremism, we need to make sure we're always talking about human rights. We need to make sure that we're at the forefront so that anytime we see something wrong, we never look away. I think that's what's led us to this position. It's the reason why I've tried to encourage the Human Rights Council to talk about these things, talk about these areas that haven't been talked about, condemn them. It's okay to, even if they're your border country, even if they're your ally or trade partner, still condemn them when you see something wrong. It's important because once they feel publicly condemned, then they'll feel shamed, and then we have to work with them to start doing the positive actions to make that get better.
As part of the United Nations Human Rights Council, one of the things that was actually a significant innovation was the invention of universal periodic review. And arguably, even if the United Nations Human Rights Council doesn't condemn states, or only condemns them in, as you pointed out, an extremely partial fashion, isn't the very fact of preparing for this review and of having the review take place something which is very important, quite apart from any kind of public statements that are made on the part of the council as a whole?
I mean, I think the reviews are very important, but that doesn't mean you don't condemn them because you're doing reviews. You still have to bring things to light. You still have to talk about injustices when you see them. This is about the Human Rights Council being better, being stronger, being smarter, and really fighting for those people that need it. It's not saying that there's not good things in the Human Rights Council. The whole reason I'm here is because I think it can be a better Human Rights Council. I think it can be a true leader. I think that the people of the world deserve it. This is the ultimate place where we expect human rights and justices to be mentioned. If they're not mentioned because someone sits on a council, then that's a problem. I had to go and bring up Venezuela in the Security Council. I brought it up because we've all seen the deaths. We've seen the political prisoners. We've seen the injustices that the government has done on the Venezuelan people. When I brought it to the Security Council, many of the members said, this is not the place to be talking about Venezuela. That's for the Human Rights Council. Well, when Venezuela sits on the Human Rights Council, how is that ever going to happen? And if they are going to sit on the Human Rights Council, all the other members should push for it anyway. It's that serious. It's that important. Those are the things we want to see with the Human Rights Council. I think the fact that they do scrutinize every single country is a great thing of the Human Rights Council, but it's not enough.
Do you think that you mentioned before that it's important that there be some degree of reciprocity, and so that countries would themselves have to be evaluated? You quoted the story from Eleanor Roosevelt about this. What types of consequences do you think happen when a country like the United States is evaluated from time to time in these kinds of situations?
I mean, I think we all have to face the fact that we're not perfect. And so when those things happen, it needs to come to everyone's attention. We need to look at the issues that we might have, and we need to go from there. The goal is to make every country stronger and smarter in the way that it deals with its own people. And that's all that the United States is looking for, is to make sure that everyone has the same rights that we do. And if they don't, encourage them to get better and encourage them to support their people more.
So among the particular human rights that most people usually include is not only a right to speech and a right, obviously, to not be killed or to be imprisoned arbitrarily and so forth, but the right of the media and the free press. Do you see there are particular countries right now where this is under some threat? It's a very innocent question.
And who would you be referring to? It's a very innocent question.
I can think of several dozen countries offhand.
Look, I mean, we're always going to be supportive of freedom of the press. I mean, that's one thing that we believe is the rights of the press to be able to speak with their voice and to be able to get out atrocities when we see them and to be able to express their opinions. We're going to continue to always support that.
If you were, and I understand you don't want to do this, but if you were to have to try to prioritize, to use that term again, different particular human rights there, are there certain kinds of human rights that you would rank higher than others? For example, the rights of political self-representation in terms of formation of political parties, obviously things about the press, things about demonstrations and so forth, or to you are they all more or less interchangeable?
I think they're all important. They're all important. We shouldn't shortchange one over the other. I think they're all important. And that's why I think we shouldn't pick and choose when we make something a priority and when we don't. If they're important, you bring it up regardless. If there's a problem, you bring it up regardless. That's the only way that countries will have a conscience of what they're doing and what they need to improve.
So let me ask you one last question, then we'll open it up for the audience here. As I said, I was referring before to the Cold War. If you think about the Cold War, and I don't think this is a terribly controversial statement, the United States was in bed, so to speak, with a number of relatively odious regimes because US presidents and secretaries of state and UN ambassadors thought that the game was worth the candle, that it was more important, given concern about communism and so forth, to be at the side of states that were doing these kind of things. And so notoriously, one of your predecessors, Jeane Kirkpatrick, wrote an infamous article called Dictatorships and Double Standards, where she actually argued that some dictatorships weren't so bad because they could eventually be overturned, whereas communist dictatorships could never be overturned. As a political scientist, that's a hypothesis that was falsified, but in any case. The question I guess I would ask is, if you think back to the bad old days of the Cold War, are there particular human rights actions the United States didn't take that you think are particularly regrettable now in hindsight? And of course, you can blame any predecessor you'd like, going back 60 to 70 years.
I mean, it's like I said earlier, I'm never going to go back and judge those in the past. I think we learn from the past. And I think that what we need to make sure we do is that we're never afraid to use the power of our voice. And we're never afraid to talk out about things. I mean, I think that dictatorships are dangerous. I'll go back to Venezuela again. It's supposed to be a strong democracy. It's turning into a dictatorship, and that's a problem. And so anytime we see that, we should always speak up. I don't think any country is excluded from that. I think when we're talking about human rights, you have to look at everyone on human rights. You have to look at them through the same lens. You have to treat them the same way. And I think that's part of what we need to do. And if other aspects of government are working on other things, that's fine, but that doesn't mean we give up talking about human rights of any country.
Okay, well, let me, at this point, try to see if there are questions that people might have. Okay, I'm not even sure where to start. Let's see. First of all, over there. Yeah. No. Yes, you. Yeah.
You mentioned a few different aspects of human rights, and I'd like to know how that influences the U.S. Condemnation of different regimes. So you mentioned democracy as one of the things that you're very upset about, and you mentioned Venezuela on account of that. I was wondering if we'll ever see a time when the U.S. will condemn Saudi Arabia, for example, for its regime. Secondly, do you define human rights within the sovereign boundaries of a nation, how it treats its own people, or do human rights also encompass how a country treats people in other countries? So cross-border warfare, is that part of human rights as well? In which case, I'd also like to ask about Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you. I just condemned Saudi Arabia in my speech, and as one of the human rights violators. I'm not going to back away from that. I think that we all know that they have lots of improvement they can make on human rights. To say it is to urge action. That's what I'm going to continue to do. And so as U.S. Ambassador to the UN, I personally care about human rights a lot. I personally think that leads to conflict. So I will continue to call out Saudi Arabia. Whenever we see anything, whenever there's something that happens, I will continue to do that. The fact that other things have happened with Saudi Arabia and the U.S., that's not in my purview, but this is. And so I'll continue to say it. And the administration is allowing me to say it and supporting me in saying it. And so I'll continue to do that. I think it's important for us to have credibility and for us to continue to fight for human rights, that we have to be willing to call out those abuses and have to be willing to make sure that we do that. And if we do that, then hopefully that strengthens and gives everyone else the ability to feel like they can step out and say something as well. It's always that we correct things when we're in numbers and when we talk with one voice. And so the more countries that can come together to encourage Saudi Arabia to change its practices, the better.
Yes, thanks. I'm John Fisher with Human Rights Watch here in Geneva, and thank you, Ambassador Hady, for your remarks.
Thank you, John.
Yes. You've obviously brought a lot of attention to ways in which the Human Rights Council could be strengthened. As an NGO, we're also very aware of the Council's shortcomings, while recognising, as you have, in many cases where it has made positive contributions. You placed a lot of focus on the question of membership, and we also have long called for competitive slates, and would be interested in your views on how that could be moved forward. I have a couple of questions as well in terms of specific countries that you have.
Can we make it, try to make it one question?
Okay, single question then. It's built on the previous question. Will the US, given your engagement, use your membership in order to, for example, bring another joint statement on China as you have in the past, or to lead an initiative on Saudi Arabia or Egypt, or at the current session of the Human Rights Council to support what we understand will be a joint statement on the Philippines, where more than 7,000 people have died in the name of President Duterte's war on drugs? Thanks.
Thank you. So we have no problem with the U.S. doing that, and that's something we want to see. But why hasn't any other member done it? Why hasn't the Council done that already? Why is it always that the U.S. has to do it? We want the U.S., if it continues to stay in the Council, to be as strong and as loud as it can be. But we shouldn't be a council of one. There should be a group council. You have 40-some-odd members. And we haven't heard anything on Venezuela. We haven't heard anything on Cuba. We haven't seen the actions we want to take. This has to be a combined reform of the Human Rights Council, all together, to decide that, yes, we're going to start acting, yes, we're going to start calling people out, and yes, we're going to do resolutions, even if it's uncomfortable, because they might be our friends in other areas. That's what the Human Rights Council was intended to do. The Human Rights Council was intended to take all politics out, all relationships out, and call out when they see something wrong. That's what the U.S. is going to encourage the human rights to do. That's in our participations. We would continue to do that and want to make sure that we continue to make it a strong force should we stay.
Yes. No, you there, yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
I am also from the United States, and I live in Geneva, and I'm very impressed by how this city really brings people together. Like many people here, I'm probably also frustrated by the bureaucracy that I see from time to time. I'm glad that you're calling for a more active human rights action being taken. However, I don't see how the two measures would necessarily lead to that. I see it fixing some existing issues, but I don't see it leading to a more active organization. I also see that, for example, taking $35 million away from UNFPA, it kind of leads to a feeling of fear with the UN that it's going to lose the US support. So how can we create a stronger, more proactive organization going beyond the 2 measures that you call for?
Thank you. I think you have to look at, those are just 2 measures, right? I think there's a lot more that we can do. And so these are just examples of what we want to see, hoping that we will see encouragement from others wanting to reform. I think you do get more activity when you call out those who haven't been called out. I think you do get more action when everyone protects each other in having resolutions that are uncomfortable to do. But that's the part that I think we need to do. Courage can change the world if you let it. And that courage is not an easy thing. It's not easy to speak up, but you have to look at the people that die because of it. You have to look at the people that are abused because of it. Are we willing to turn a blind eye in the name of politics? We can't do that. And so I think that what I'm trying to do, and I think what I hope the US can do, is push the Human Rights Council to be so strong and so reputable that we would want to be a part of it, that we would want to see it strong, that we would want to stay in it. That's my hope. That's my goal. So I think that what we've done is we've put some things out there to say we want to see changes. I think that, certainly you can do reforms and efficiencies and all of those things in any area. We're doing that in New York, is working on whether it's peacekeeping reforms, whether it's management reforms. We're trying to reform as much as we can, and we're seeing a lot of support from member states in doing that. What I hope is the engagement and the proposal of reforms in the Human Rights Council, I hope we'll see a lot of support from member states that want to join us in doing that. And at the end of the day, we'll wait and see. But I think it's just the start. It's not intended to be the end. It's the start of making sure that we're doing everything we can for those that are vulnerable.
I think we have time for just one more question. I know. Okay. Yes, back there. Okay, and this will be the last one, I'm afraid.
Hi, Ambassador Haley. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
For the last 2 years, I have worked and been conducting research on the Human Rights Council. I appreciate your willingness to engage in dialogue. Since Trump has won and the administration has come in, as an American, it's been embarrassing to be abroad. I don't see the US government now, led by someone who brags about assaulting women and lies about immigration and globalization and calls most Mexican immigrants rapists, as kind of committing to the things that you are talking about. And I also see some kind of hypocrisy in the fact that you worry about children in Syria, but we don't accept them in as refugees. But now my questions are more about... Don't take away from my time. No, but okay. But no, real quick, can you commit yes or no that the US will not withdraw from the Human Rights Council? And also, would you more elaborate upon something in the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt, that the HRC Commission would, that the US would be amenable to the HRC, the Human Rights Council, investigating the abuses of human rights within the US, particularly in the case of Guantanamo Bay and the general abuses of the war in Iraq? Thank you.
So that was a lot, right? So I'll try and kind of dissect that a little bit and see what we can do. So the first thing I want to talk about is the refugee situation, because it's an important one. And I think that basically what we know is that the president is adamant that he wants to make sure the vetting process works. I know when I was a governor of South Carolina, we always took in refugees. I know the good of refugees. My husband was deployed to Afghanistan. He served for a year, and there were 2 interpreters that kept them alive. And when he was coming back, that was the one thing we worked to do, was to make sure that we got the interpreters out so they wouldn't be killed. So South Carolina had a long history of accepting refugees, because there is a lot of good to make sure we do in keeping people from persecution. Having said that, when the Syrian refugee situation came up, I had called Director Comey, and I said, okay, how is this any different than any other refugee situation? And he said, we don't have any information on them. And I said, well, at what point will you get them? And he said, there's absolutely nothing. There's no way for us to vet. So knowing that that's the information the president has, what he's done is he's told his members, security members, find a way that we can vet in a way that we can be comfortable and the American people can be comfortable. That's a process that's ongoing. Now let's go to the Syrian refugee side. The Syrian refugees do matter. That's why I just recently got back from Turkey and Jordan, was to see what we're doing for Syrian refugees. The U.S. has spent $6.5 billion on Syrian refugees. We want to make sure they're safe and they're healthy. So what we've done is we went to Jordan, we went to Turkey to see what the conditions were. And in Jordan, we saw that they have been an unbelievable host country in the way that they're providing health care and education and stipends, but they're receiving a lot of pressure from the people in the area because of competitive jobs and some other things. We went to Turkey, and here's a country that's taken 3 million refugees. So you're seeing in both countries double shifts of schools. You're seeing roads that are more packed. You're seeing infrastructure that is more pressed. And you're seeing governments working very hard to try and do what they see as their duty. So one of the things we did was talk to both governments. We talked about access of NGOs to the Prime Minister in Turkey and the importance of making sure that gets into Syria. We talked about the needs of the Syrian people, but more importantly, I spent so much time with Syrians in refugee camps and outside of refugee camps. So what we tried to do was find out what else they needed. They said they needed psychological support because they've experienced so much trauma. And then they also said that they wanted to go back home. Not one of them said they wanted to come to the United States. What they all said was they needed support and assistance to get back into Syria. He had so many questions. Which one do you want me to? Well, the point on the refugees is important. We have to make sure that when we're dealing with the refugees, we are doing something about the refugees. The U.S. feels a moral position to do something about the refugees, and we're going to continue to do that. I know I'm not going to commit today on whether we're staying in or out of the Human Rights Council because we haven't seen it yet. We have to see the actions of the council. We have to see the actions of member states to decide whether we're going to do that or not. And so we'll wait and see. What I can tell you is we have come here in good faith. We've come here in good faith because it would benefit the United States to have a strong Human Rights Council. It would benefit the international community to have a strong Human Rights Council. We are attempting to do what we can to make it strong. I don't know if we'll be successful, but I know we're going to try, and I know we're going to do everything we can. And so while you may say the administration is not showing certain actions, I am. And I am part of that team. And so if I'm going and talking to the refugees in Syria, if I'm going and trying to work on getting the Human Rights Council, if I'm bringing it up in New York, those are all things I'm going to continue to do to be loud on the issue. And that's all I know to do. But I will tell you, the U.S. is always going to be strong on human rights. When you look at the budget and all the talk of the budget, I can tell you that we see the UN as a place where we can have a lot of opportunities. It's why you see us using it more for foreign policy. It's why you're seeing us get it more involved in peacekeeping missions, because when it came to peacekeeping, what we saw were a lot of missions were just being renewed. We weren't seeing effective work. We weren't seeing that they were actually doing all they could to help the people on the ground. So now in peacekeeping missions, what we're doing is we're going back to the political solution. We're looking at the intent. What they had done in the past was throw more troops at it. What we're saying is, what good are the troops if they don't have the equipment and they're not trained? And so now we're starting to get smarter about the way we do peacekeeping so that we're actually helping the people that are out there.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that really is all that we have time for today. But I want to thank the ambassador very much for coming, and I want to apologize to the audience for the 40 or 50 of you who didn't have a chance to ask questions. Perhaps she'll come back at some point. Yes, this is my turn, right. So thank you again very much.
Thank you very much.